Every ship that entered the Black Nebula vanished without a trace, without a distress signal, without even a final whisper of static. For 300 years, the galaxy treated the roiling darkness as a tomb. Then a human named Elias Vance filed a flight plan that made the Galactic Council laugh themselves hoarse. He marked his destination as the one place no living pilot had ever dared to chart. He planned to fly straight through the heart of the nightmare. The loss of the Corsair's dream had been the first. Back when the Galactic Union still believed in exploration without fear, the luxury liner had veered 3 degrees off course to avoid a solar flare. Its last transmission was a single word. Not a scream, not a prayer. Just the ship's ID code, repeated twice, growing slower and deeper until the audio stretched into something that sounded almost like a growl. The rescue fleet found nothing. No debris, no escape pods, not even a heat signature. The Corsair's dream had simply stopped existing. Over the decades, the numbers climbed in hushed increments. A military frigate chasing a pirate vessel, a science vessel chasing a neutrino anomaly, a smuggler's freighter trying to shave off 2 days of travel time, 212 by the time the Union formally classified the Black Nebula as an exclusion zone. 50 more before the first recorded attempt to map its boundaries ended with the survey ship's final telemetry showing its crew panicking over gravitational readings that should have been impossible. The last frame of their data stream showed an officer staring at his console as the numbers melted into symbols no known species had ever written. The official count stopped at 312. Not because no more ships had been lost, but because the Union's Bureau of Cosmic Hazards realized that every new disappearance only deepened the terror. They sealed the records, posted warning beacons across a 200-light-year perimeter, and instructed all civilized species to treat the nebula as they would a black hole. You did not approach it. You did not study it. You did not even look at it too long, because some of the older navigators swore they could feel it looking back. Admiral Voss of the Thalian Sovereignty had commanded the last official observation post near the nebula's edge. He was a patient creature, built from thick cartilage and slow-burning neural fibers that made his species famous for strategic thinking. After 15 years of watching the roiling blackness from a safe distance, he had concluded that the nebula was not malicious. It was simply a flaw in the universe, a tear in reality where physics forgot how to behave. The ships that entered it did not die. They were simply erased, their atoms scattered across dimensions that had no use for conscious thought. He believed this with the same certainty that he believed in gravity and radiation burns, until the human arrived. The message came through the emergency diplomatic channel, which meant Admiral Voss was required to watch it personally. The human on the screen had the kind of face that looked like it had been put through a survival scenario before breakfast. Lean, angular, with eyes that didn't quite blink enough. His uniform identified him as Captain Elias Vance, contracted courier for the Interstellar Cargo Alliance. His ship was listed as the Last Stand, a battered medium hauler with aftermarket thrusters, and a hull that had been patched so many times it looked like quilted armor. "Admiral Voss," the human said without preamble, "I'm carrying a delivery for the Karathi border colonies, a batch of terraforming stabilizers that will keep 500,000 people from suffocating when their atmospheric processes fail in 72 hours. The fastest safe route takes 68 hours. That gives me a 4-hour window for mechanical failure, pirate interdiction, or bureaucratic delays. I don't like those odds." Voss's neural fibers tightened. He already knew where this was going, but he forced himself to ask anyway. "What route are you proposing, Captain?" "The nebula cut 6,000 light-years off the journey," Vance said. "If I go straight through, I make the delivery in 40 hours, give or take." The Admiral's adjutant, a young Thalian named Silix who had never met a human before, made a sound like wet paper tearing. Voss raised a hand to silence her. "Captain, I'm going to assume you have not been properly briefed on the Black Nebula's history. 312 vessels have entered that region. None have returned. No signals, no debris, no survivors. The likelihood of your survival is statistically indistinguishable from zero." Vance's expression didn't change. "Statistically, sure, but statistics don't mean much when you're the one flying the ship. This is not a matter of bravery or skill," Voss pressed, his voice hardening. "The nebula exhibits gravitational and electromagnetic anomalies that defy current physical models. Your sensors will fail. Your navigation computer will lose lock on every reference point. You will be flying blind into a volume of space where the laws of reality become suggestions. My sensors have fail-safes, Vance replied. My navigation computer has redundancy protocols, and my ship has something none of those 312 vessels had. Voss waited. The human leaned closer to the camera, and for the first time the Admiral saw something in those pale eyes that made his ancient evolutionary instincts murmur warnings. It wasn't aggression, it wasn't recklessness, it was something far more unsettling. It was curiosity. I've spent the last 6 months studying every scrap of data from every ship that went near that nebula, Vance said. Not the official reports, the raw telemetry, the stuff the Union buried because it made their experts look incompetent. The gravitational anomalies follow a pattern. The signal distortions mirror known encryption harmonics. Whatever is inside that cloud isn't random chaos. It's a system, and systems can be understood. Silix finally found her voice. You're insane. The nebula is a death zone. Even approaching it causes instrument failure and psychological distress. The captains of those lost ships were not fools. They were the best pilots their species had produced. Vance shrugged. Then their best wasn't good enough. He cut the transmission before Voss could respond. The Admiral sat in silence for a long moment, his neural fibers processing the conversation through layers of disbelief and something else. Something that felt like the first stirrings of genuine fear. Not for himself, for the human. Because if Vance was wrong, he would become number 313, another name added to a list that no one read anymore. But if he was right, then the Black Nebula was not a tomb, it was a door, and humanity had just decided to turn the handle. The last stand dropped out of warp at the nebula's perimeter 12 hours later. Admiral Voss watched from his observation post, his sensors trained on the tiny speck of metal that had just committed itself to a course that every other pilot in the galaxy would have fled. The nebula sprawled across the viewport like a wound in space, a bruise of black and deep violet that seemed to drink the starlight around it. Even at this distance, Voss could feel the wrongness of it, a pressure against his consciousness that made his thoughts feel sluggish and thin. Vance's voice came through the comm channel, clear and calm. Last stand to observation post. I'm reading you at 5x5. Beginning final approach now. Captain Vance, Voss said, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't intended. The Union will not authorize this incursion. If you proceed, you do so without any expectation of rescue or recovery. Your contract will be voided. Your license will be revoked. Noted, Vance said. But here's the thing, Admiral. 500,000 people are going to die if I don't make this delivery on time. The Union can revoke my license all it wants. It can't revoke my conscience. The last stand fired its maneuvering thrusters and began its final descent toward the nebula's edge. Voss watched the telemetry as the ship's sensors began to register the first anomalies. Gravitational fluctuations that should have torn a vessel of that size apart. Electromagnetic interference that spiked and dropped in patterns that almost looked deliberate. The ship's hull temperature spiked, then plummeted, then spiked again, cycling through extremes that would have cracked lesser alloys. Reading some interesting data here, Vance murmured, more to himself than to Voss. The gravitational shear is oscillating at a frequency that matches the ship's structural resonance. If I was flying a standard freighter, those harmonics would shake me apart in about 90 seconds. But the last stand has a custom damping system, built it myself. Voss watched the telemetry shift as Vance adjusted something on his console. The gravitational oscillations began to smooth out, the spikes rounding into gentler curves. The electromagnetic interference dropped from deafening static to a manageable hiss. The hull temperature stabilized at something just above uncomfortable. You modified your ship specifically for this, Voss said. It wasn't a question. I modified my ship to handle the unexpected, Vance replied. The fact that it happens to handle the Black Nebula's particular brand of unexpected is just good engineering. The last stand crossed the nebula's boundary. Voss's sensors lost visual contact instantly, the roiling darkness swallowing the ship like a tongue pulling a fly into a mouth. But the telemetry feed remained open, a thin thread of data stretching from the human ship to the observation post. Voss watched the numbers scroll past, his neural fibers firing faster than they had in decades. The first thing to go was the ship's orientation sensors. The telemetry showed the last stand rotating along axes that shouldn't exist, spinning through dimensions that had no names. Vance's voice remained calm, almost bored. Gyros are confused. Switching to backup inertial reference, that's holding steady, for now. The second thing to go was the ship's chronometer. The clock began to stutter, jumping forward and backward in erratic bursts. One reading showed that the last stand had been inside the nebula for 3 minutes. The next showed 17 hours. The next showed negative 12 seconds. Time dilation effects are unusual, Vance said, not following relativistic models. More like the nebula is treating time as a suggestion rather than a law. I'm locking the ship's internal clock to my heart rate. Biological systems are harder to confuse than quartz crystals. Voss leaned forward, his cartilage creaking. The human was adapting, in real time. While flying through a region of space that had erased 312 ships, he was actively reprogramming his own instruments to compensate for physics that didn't make sense. It was the most terrifying thing Voss had ever witnessed. The telemetry feed began to fragment, not from interference but from something stranger. The data packets were arriving out of order, not just in sequence but in causality. Voss received a packet that claimed the last stand had already reached the nebula's center, then a packet that showed the ship entering the nebula for the first time, then a packet that seemed to come from a future that hadn't happened yet, showing Vance staring at his console with an expression of exhausted triumph. "The nebula is bleeding causality," Voss muttered. "It's not just distorting space, it's distorting time itself." Silix grabbed his arm, her claws digging into his hide. "Sir, the telemetry. Look at the energy readings." Voss focused on the relevant data stream. The last stand was registering energy signatures from inside the nebula, dozens of them, hundreds of them. Each one matched the power profile of a different ship. The Corsair's Dream, the military frigate Valiant, the science vessel Inquiry. Every lost ship, their reactors still running, their systems still active, trapped somewhere inside the blackness like flies in amber. "Captain Vance," Voss said, his voice barely a whisper, "you are not alone in there." "I know," Vance replied. "I've been picking up their transponders for the last 10 minutes or the last 10 years, it's hard to tell. The interesting thing is that they're not just floating debris. They're intact, powered. Some of them are still transmitting." "Transmitting what?" A pause. When Vance spoke again, his voice had lost some of its calm. "The same thing. All of them. A repeating pattern that matches the nebula's own energy signature. It's like they've been assimilated. Their systems are still running, but they're running the nebula's code now, not their own." Voss felt a cold dread settle into his oldest bones. The nebula wasn't a graveyard. It was a collector. It reached out, caught ships in its gravitational web, and rewrote their systems to serve whatever purpose it had been designed for. The lost crews were probably still aboard those vessels, still breathing, still thinking, but their thoughts were no longer their own. "You need to turn back," Voss said, "now, before it takes you too." "Can't," Vance said. "The gravitational gradients are too steep for a turnaround. My only way out is forward, but that's fine, because I'm starting to see the pattern." The telemetry feed flickered, and for a single frame Voss saw something that made his neural fibers freeze. The last stand's external cameras had captured a brief image of the nebula's interior. It wasn't empty. It wasn't chaotic. It was structured. Thousands of luminous filaments stretched across the darkness, forming geometric patterns that looked almost like circuitry. At the center of the pattern, barely visible through the haze, was something vast, something that pulsed with a slow rhythmic light that reminded Voss of a heartbeat. "What is that?" Silix breathed. Voss didn't answer, because at that moment, the last stand's comm channel erupted with sound, not static, not interference, voices. Hundreds of voices, speaking in dozens of languages, all of them saying the same thing. The same word that the Corsair's Dream had transmitted 3 centuries ago. But now Voss understood it, not as a word, but as a designation, a name. The nebula was speaking, and it was introducing itself. The voices stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The telemetry feed stabilized, showing the last stand continuing its impossible journey through the heart of the blackness. Vance was silent for a long moment, his hands moving across his console with a speed that suggested he was running out of time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Admiral, I need you to pull up the historical records for the 312 lost ships, all of them. Look at their approach vectors, their entry points, their final known positions. Voss gestured to Silix, who began pulling the files with trembling hands. The data scrolled across his display, and Voss felt his neural fibers begin to fire in a pattern he had never experienced before, a pattern that felt like the universe was shifting around him. The ships hadn't entered the nebula randomly. They had entered along specific trajectories that, when plotted together, formed a perfect spiral, a spiral that led directly to the pulsing heart Voss had seen in that single frame of camera footage. They were guided, Voss said. The nebula pulled them in, herded them toward the center. Not herded, Vance corrected, programmed. The nebula isn't a natural phenomenon, it's a trap, a really, really old trap, and someone left the safety off. The last stand's sensors began to register something new, a signal. Weak at first, then growing stronger as Vance approached the nebula's core. It wasn't a distress call, it wasn't a warning, it was an invitation, a mathematical sequence that unfolded like a flower, each layer revealing more complexity than the last. Vance stared at his display for a long moment, then he laughed. It wasn't a hysterical laugh or a relieved laugh, it was the laugh of someone who had just solved a puzzle that everyone else had given up on. "It's a navigation lock," he said, "like a digital deadbolt. The ships that came in here tried to force their way through, use their standard drives, their standard sensors, their standard thinking, and the nebula punished them for it, rewrote their systems, absorbed their crews, added them to its collection. But you haven't been absorbed," Voss said, "because I'm not trying to force anything. I'm following the pattern. The nebula wants something, it's been waiting for something, and I think I just figured out what." The telemetry feed showed Vance entering a series of commands into his console, not navigation commands, encryption commands. He was trying to communicate with the nebula, to speak to it in its own language. The mathematical sequence on his display began to change, responding to his input, like a student answering a teacher's questions. "What are you doing?" Voss demanded. "I'm negotiating," Vance said. The pulsing heart at the nebula's center flared with light. The last stand's hull temperature spiked, then stabilized. The gravitational shear vanished entirely. The electromagnetic interference cleared, revealing a clear channel that stretched from the human ship all the way back to the observation post. And then the nebula spoke. Not through the comm channel, not through the telemetry feed. Directly into Admiral Voss's mind, a voice made of gravity and light, an ancient, patient intelligence. "You are not the expected one." Voss gripped his armrest, his claws sinking into the metal. The voice carried no malice, no warmth, no emotion at all. It was like being addressed by a star, immense and indifferent and absolutely certain of its own purpose. "Who is the expected one?" Voss managed. "The one who codes, the one who adapts, the one who does not break." Voss looked at the telemetry feed, at Elias Vance, calmly reprogramming his ship's systems to match the nebula's chaotic frequencies, at the human who had looked at a tomb that had claimed 312 vessels and seen a problem to be solved. "Him," Voss said, "the human." The nebula was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its voice carried something new, something that might have been curiosity. "We have not encountered your species before." "We're new," Vance said, cutting into the conversation. "But we learn fast, and here's what I've learned about you in the last hour. You're not a trap. You're a filter. You were designed to test pilots, to find the ones who could think differently, who could adapt, who could survive your tests and emerge on the other side. The 312 ships that came before me failed because they tried to fight you. They used their weapons, their shields, their rigid military protocols. And you broke them for it. They were inferior." "They were different," Vance corrected. "Different isn't inferior. It's just not what you were looking for, but I am what you're looking for, aren't I? That's why you let me this far. That's why you haven't rewritten my systems or absorbed my mind. You want to see what I can do." The nebula's response was immediate and absolute. The filaments of light that stretched across its interior began to move, rearranging themselves into new patterns, new challenges, new tests. The last stand, sensors screamed warnings as the gravitational gradients shifted. The electromagnetic interference spiked, and the time dilation effects grew so severe that Vance's heart rate monitor began to stutter. "Captain, your vitals are destabilizing," Silix shouted. "I noticed," Vance grunted. His hands flew across the console, adjusting, compensating, rewriting his ship's operating system in real time. But here's the thing about filters. They're designed to let something through. You just have to figure out what shape the hole is. The last stand lurched as a new gravitational wave hit it from a direction that shouldn't have existed. Vance's chair tore from its mounting, slamming him against the ceiling before the artificial gravity could compensate. He caught a handhold, pulled himself back to his console, and kept typing. Blood dripped from a cut on his forehead, spattering across the display as he entered the final sequence of commands. "Admiral, I'm going to transmit something to you," Vance said. "A data packet. I need you to broadcast it on all frequencies. Union channels, military channels, civilian channels. Everyone who will listen." "What is it?" "It's a key. The Nebula's navigation lock, decoded. Any ship with this key can fly through the Nebula safely. No more disappearing. No more assimilation. The filter will recognize them as authorized and let them pass." Voss stared at the transmission in disbelief. "You cracked it in less than 2 hours, too." "I had help," Vance said. A strange smile crossed his face. "The crews of those 312 ships aren't dead, Admiral. They're still in there. Their minds are part of the Nebula now, part of the filter. And they've been trying to communicate with anyone who would listen for centuries. I just finally listened." The telemetry feed showed the last stand approaching the Nebula's far edge. The roiling blackness was thinning, the starscape of normal space visible through the haze. Vance was going to make it. He had navigated the impossible, solved the unsolvable, and was about to become the first pilot in galactic history to cross the Black Nebula and live. But the Nebula wasn't done with him yet. "You have passed the test." The voice was different now, softer, almost gentle. "But the test was not for you." Vance's hands paused over his console. "What do you mean?" "The filter was designed to find a specific trait, a trait that your species possesses in abundance. The 312 failed because they were alone. You succeeded because you were not." Voss felt the realization hit him like a physical blow. The Nebula wasn't testing individual pilots. It was testing species, testing whether they would send one of their own into the darkness alone, or whether they would send help, whether they would abandon their lost ships to their fate, or whether they would risk everything to bring them home. The 312 ships had been tests, and every species had failed. They had written off their lost vessels, sealed the records, declared the Nebula an exclusion zone. They had looked at their dead and decided that the dead weren't worth the risk. But the humans had sent Elias Vance, not because the Union ordered it, not because the military commanded it, because one man had looked at 500,000 dying civilians and decided that the risk was worth taking. Because one species had looked at the darkness and refused to be afraid. Your species has passed. The filaments of light began to fade. The gravitational gradient smoothed into nothing. The electromagnetic interference vanished. The last stand emerged from the Black Nebula's far side, its hull scarred and smoking, its systems flickering, but intact. Vance slumped in his chair, breathing hard, his hand still pressed against the bleeding cut on his forehead. Behind him, the Nebula began to change. The roiling blackness thinned, revealing the structures within. The filaments of light went dark, one by one. The pulsing heart at the center slowed, then stopped. The Black Nebula, the terror of 3 centuries, the tomb of 312 ships, was opening. Not collapsing, opening, like a door that had finally found the right key. Voss watched as the first of the lost ships emerged. The Corsair's Dream, its hull pristine, its lights blazing, drifting out of the Nebula's remains like a ghost returning from the dead. Then the Valiant, then the Inquiry, ship after ship, emerging from the darkness that had held them for so long. Their crews were at the controls, blinking in the sudden light, confused and disoriented, but alive. "Captain Vance," Voss said, his voice thick with something he refused to name, "you didn't just deliver those terraforming stabilizers. You delivered 312 ships. You delivered thousands of souls." Vance's voice came through the comm, tired but satisfied. "Like I said, systems can be understood, and humans?" He paused, and Voss could hear the grin in his voice even if he couldn't see it. Humans are really good at understanding systems, especially the ones that are trying to kill us. The last stand continued its journey toward the Kirathi border colonies, its engines burning bright against the darkness of space. Behind it, the black nebula faded into memory, its purpose fulfilled, its long vigil finally ended. And across the galaxy, every species that had ever written off the nebula as a death zone received the same transmission, the same data packet, the same key, accompanied by a simple message from Admiral Voss of the Thalaean sovereignty. 3 words that changed everything the galaxy thought it knew about humanity. They went through.